This sermon is several years in the making. Going back many years ago in our previous building, we were getting up to leave from a service that had included communion, and Emily just casually commented how she was hungry. And this is a glimpse into the weird way that my brain works sometimes, that the part of my brain that studied neuroscience kicked in, and I wondered out loud if there was a bit of the appetizer effect at play from the communion elements. The basic idea of this appetizer effect is that when you have a little bit of food, especially certain types of food, it triggers your brain into thinking that it's time to eat. So your body starts redirecting its energy from doing other functions to prioritize getting ready to digest that food. And if more food doesn't come quickly enough, then you're hungrier than if you hadn't eaten that appetizer, because now your body is trying to digest something that's not actually there. Then my neuroscience brain took a backseat and my theology brain jumped in instead. And I started thinking that maybe this is what's happening with communion. Quite possibly not in the physical sense, but definitely in a more spiritual analogy sense. A phrase that you'll sometimes hear in theological speak is the idea that the kingdom of God is now but not yet. And there's some sense in which it started, but it's not complete, it's not full. So my own phrasing of that idea today is that we can experience this appetizer of the way of Jesus now, especially at the communion table, but it's not the whole meal yet. And I hope this analogy works for somebody else because it has been stuck in my head for years ever since then. At one point, I was scheduled to preach this on World Communion Day 2020 before, all the plans changed for a couple of years. And one of the best things to come out of that delay is that Ed gave a great sermon on communion back this past May. And Ed's had a bit more of a deconstructionist lens to it. If you are starting from a place where you've inherited a more damaging view of communion, where this is something that is harmful for you, then sometimes you have to deconstruct that first before you can start building up something that's healthier. So if you're in that boat, I give you full permission to tune me out a little bit, go back and listen to Ed's instead. It's the May 28th video, it's not available publicly, but you can find it in the link in the members only section of the website, which I did find a little bit ironic given the theme of that message. But Ed's starting point was that communion should not be about qualification. It's whether that's by baptism or membership or anything else. Instead, it's an invitation. It comes with some meaning and responsibility to accept that invitation, some expectation that we will be changed. But everybody is invited. He also gets into some other aspects like the symbolisms of the bread and the wine. I'm going to avoid repeating all of that, but also very good. And I've heard others use the language that communion is filling or satisfying. There was even some of that in the opening prayer, the Carol Penno piece today. And that might seem contradictory to my appetizer analogy, but I do think there's one level in which that's true, that it should feel substantial on its own, that a meal within a loving community is already powerful. And like the deconstruction idea, do I need a little better? Okay, let's try this. Is that better? Like the deconstruction idea, it might depend a bit on your context as well. Maybe today you really do just need to experience this and let that be enough. And don't worry about the hunger appetizer stuff. But I think this idea that Ed gave of an invitation into something good rather than a qualification list, that fits with my appetizer analogy. If we're doing communion well, we should feel like we are being invited into something good. But it's not just the good of the communion table for its own sake. That's just the taste of this bigger way of Jesus that everyone is invited into. In the book, Searching for Sunday, that a group of us are reading together, also Rachel Held Evans points out that there are a lot of varieties in how we do communion across traditions. But one thing that is pretty consistent is the use of the word remember or remembrance. We have it engraved on the front of our table here. At the simplest level, the invitation of this ritual is to remember. And one of the other names for this ritual is the Eucharist, which means the Thanksgiving. It's a remembering something good that we are thankful for. And I took a course on human memory back in university. I don't remember most of it, but I do remember some pieces of how do we reinforce memories. Repetition is a huge part of that. The more you do something, the stronger that neural pathway in your brain will become. And that's a lot of why we do rituals in general, or we set up statues or plaques, or we do things like have land acknowledgements and wearing orange shirts, which I see a couple more here today. The more that we encounter something and we associate it with that deeper meaning, the more that meaning can become reinforced in our brains. And another big factor in strengthening memory is embodiment. The more cues that we are giving our brain, the more senses that we are engaging, the more possibilities for those memory pathways to be activated. And in Searching for Sunday, Rachel quotes from Barbara Brown Taylor, saying, "With all the conceptual truths in the universe at his disposal, Jesus did not give them something to think about when he was gone. Instead, he gave them concrete things to do, specific ways of being together in their bodies that would go on teaching them what they needed to know when he was no longer around to teach them himself. Do this, he said, not believe this, but do this, in remembrance of me." And it's also worth noting that this is a communal memory. It's not primarily about you individually. It is about us as a community choosing to remember Jesus and shape our communal life around that memory. And we won't remember perfectly because we are not perfect people. Memory is not perfect. But we can get that appetizer taste, that spark of hunger that reminds us that this is the story that we want to be a part of. And if it is in remembrance of Jesus, that means that it's Jesus' table, it's not our table, which kind of reinforces the idea that Ed was talking about in that previous sermon of seems a little bit silly and missing the point if we start drawing up the rules for who gets included at Jesus' table. One of Jesus' parables in the Gospels, the passage from Luke that we read today, is about a man who decides to throw a banquet, and then he has trouble finding enough people to accept the invitation. And we sang the song in my church growing up that openly mocked those who are too important to attend the banquet, to accept the invitation. Some of you may have encountered this old hymn as well. It's weird for a hymn to be openly mocking people, and even weirder that we sang it in the voice of those that we were mocking. The chorus would say, and if you know this, "I cannot come to the banquet, don't trouble me now, I have married a wife, I have bought me a cow." I'm not going to attempt to sing. I said it somewhat rhythmically, that's the closest I get. There is some responsibility to joining a party, as these important people who rejected the invitation, they are demonstrating. It can take time, including time away from your new cow, I guess. It might be awkward if you don't know everyone. If you're a narcoleptic introvert like me, it might just be really tiring. You'll need a month to recover. It's like I probably will after speaking a lot today. And the host of the banquet in the parable isn't chasing those respectable, important people. the people who have said no. He isn't pleading with them or coercing them into doing something that they don't want to do. And we see similar in other times in Jesus' ministry where somebody walks away because they've decided the cost is too great, and Jesus just lets them. If one extreme is that fence of declaring who is allowed in and who is not, the other extreme would be trying to force everybody to take part, whether they want to or not, which is largely the story of Christendom, up to and including some Christian nationalist movements today. And I also wonder if part of why these important people declined was because they knew this was the kind of host who would invite others that they didn't want to be associated with. Because the host doesn't stop trying to expand the table from there. He next calls for the poor and the disabled to be brought in as well. In the context of communion and really church in general, there might be many reasons why we would want to opt out. But if we are doing this church thing right, the biggest one should be that it feels like there's a cost to it. If you are somebody who's used to a level of privilege, there should be some cost to joining. And some people are going to decide that they don't want to pay that cost. Right before the parable in this reading, Jesus says to start by inviting the poor and otherwise marginalized. To use a phrase from liberation theology, God has a preferential option for the poor. That's where God starts. The rituals, the systems, the structures, they need to be starting around the marginalized and working from there. Starting with the marginalized ensures that everybody who wants to be a part of it gets to eat. And this does come towards what's often called the paradox of tolerance. This is the idea that if you want to have a tolerant space, you have to be intolerant of those who are being intolerant, or else there isn't also space for the people who are being hurt by that intolerance. And it is my least favorite paradox, because I don't think of it quite in those terms. That relies a little bit on still using that fence or qualification kind of language, that somebody is determining the rules of the space and enforcing them. And I want to stick with that invitation language. So this isn't simply an invitation to eat and drink, period. It is an invitation into the way of Jesus. And the table of Jesus is a place of safety and openness for everyone. So if you are entering that table in a way that violates that concept, then you're not really entering Jesus' table at that point. You're trying to create a different table instead that's more to your liking. And I did have a longer section here about a text in Corinthians that many of you might be familiar with. I had to cut that down to fit in time, but we will be continuing discussion in adult ed, so if you're interested, then you can ask about that some more there. The bottom line is that, yes, sometimes to maintain a table that remembers that this is Jesus' table for everybody, we do sometimes have to point out where we are setting up boundaries. And maybe we've set those boundaries by accident without considering some other marginalized group. Maybe there was a boundary that made sense 10 years ago, but doesn't make sense now, and it's become counterproductive. We won't do this equitable table perfectly, of course, especially when we are starting from a largely privileged position. But again, with the appetizer idea, we don't necessarily need it to be perfect right away. You aim to do it well enough that we get hungry for more, that we start to experience what this loving table is like. And that can spark a positive feedback loop where another person feels safe here, and they might help us see another way that we could do better after that. So as we receive these elements today, I hope that it gives us that little taste of a better world. I hope that it gives us more hope. Then we go back to seeing that broken world, we feel that disconnect, but instead of being discouraged by that, we use that hunger, we tap into that appetizer that we've had to empower us to help better feed ourselves and others.